Have you ever had Achilles pain or Achilles issues? This is super common for so many people, but how people go about approaching trying to address it is missing some things that we want to highlight for you on this week's episode of the Exercises Health Podcast. We're going to cue our introduction. We're going to dive right into this conversation. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast, brought to you by Exercise for Life Studios and Muscle Activation Schaumburg, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie.
And today we are focusing on the Achilles. Now, if you have ever had Achilles issues, you know how much of a pain these things can be. I mean, every single time you take a step, any time you try to exert yourself, the Achilles flares up. Now, here's the thing. This is not just for athletes. I work with a lot of basketball players. They have a lot of Achilles issues, but this is not just for athletes because I've had so many non-athletes, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s that complain of Achilles issues. So what we're going to share with you today will help anybody that has an Achilles issue, because what we are sharing goes so far beyond what the mainstream approach to addressing Achilles issues is, and it's often overlooked, but it's often the missing link to making sure your Achilles stays functioning well long after the symptoms go away.
That's right. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with what the Achilles is, maybe you've never had an Achilles issue before, the Achilles is a tendon that connects your calf muscles into your heel bone. So if you think about like the bone that makes your heel, it attaches into the top of your heel bone, so still like the behind your leg almost, and then it attaches up into your calf muscle. So usually people think that they have or feel they have an Achilles issue when that area of their body, that lower leg on the back side of their lower leg, is feeling symptomatic or sharp or feeling like it's about to snap. Those would be what we're talking about when we are having Achilles issues. So the first thing is that most of the times, whenever we have an issue, we're always thinking locally, right? Almost all, even when it happens to you, first you think, oh, got to get rid of the pain or the discomfort that's here. So we think about, of course, working with the ankle. And that's the common place where people are working, because that Achilles tendon, that Achilles area, is controlling the ankle joint. And so, of course, we always think, well, something's wrong with my ankle. So that is a great place to look and start strengthening. But we have to start looking more than that, because there's a lot of more contributing and highly contributing areas to this area.
Absolutely. I mean, I get targeted on Instagram with ads for these devices to try to help strengthen the Achilles, and they're all ankle focused, whether it's, things for like would be a calf raise thing, or something that, your foot wobbles back and forth on. They're all very ankle focused. And sometimes they start to explore some foot and toe stuff, but far and away the primary focus in kind of traditional thinking is going to be focusing on the ankle. The first, the mobility of the ankle, and then secondly, the strength of the muscles and a lot of the ligaments that cross that ankle. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it is incomplete. And so we want to start exploring other things with you today to paint a more complete picture of things that we have seen be effective across the board for our clients, as well as things that you can start thinking about and adding in to your own workout routines to help make sure that your Achilles stay not only just like intact, but like also like minimize stress going through them. Okay, so one thing that we need to understand is when it comes to mobility is more times than not preceded by muscle strength and muscle function. And this is a primary kind of cornerstone principle of muscle activation techniques. This idea that stability, that strength, that muscle function precede mobility. The better your muscles function, the stronger your muscles are, the more stability there is there, the more mobility will be created in response. The more mobility will be available in response. In MAT, we say that tightness is secondary to weakness. And so this cornerstone principle of MAT we see play out with a lot of the ideas around trying to help people with their Achilles as well. But what else do we need to consider? If we are focusing on the strength and not necessarily mobility, if we're focusing on the function and not necessarily mobility, if we're expanding beyond the ankle and not just focusing on the ankle directly, what else do we need to consider? The first area that needs to strongly be considered is the knees, and specifically the function and strength of the muscles that control the knees. Yes, your quadriceps, yes, your hamstrings, but there are a number of other muscles as well that help to influence the knees, that will keep the knees strong and protected, but also keep the knees moving well. Again, the stronger and better functioning these groups of muscles are, the more mobile the knees will be. Why this is so important is because if your knees don't have the requisite motion of the activities that you're doing, meaning they can't bend as well as you need them to, well, specifically when we're thinking about Achilles, oftentimes it does relate to kind of the bending of the knee, but the straightening can be involved as well. The ankle oftentimes has to pick up more motion. The foot itself has to pick up more motion, which can put more stress through the Achilles. So making sure that the muscles that are able to control the knees and able to move the knees are strong and functioning well really is a critical component to kind of working through different Achilles issues that somebody may be having.
Yeah, Charlie, I love that you brought up the knees first because not only is it like the neighboring joint to the ankle, which is what we usually associate with Achilles issues, but it also has shared muscles. Like literally the same muscles that can control and keep the knee strong are also controlling and keeping the ankle strong, which we know has a big influence on how much stress that Achilles tendon is taking on at any one point. The next area that we want you to consider that we see all the time strongly influencing the ankles and the feet is the hips. Your hips and your hip muscles need to be strong and functioning well. And when they aren't strong and functioning well, oftentimes we see that type of limitations trickling down and highly influencing symptomatically and function-wise in the knees and in the ankles and feet. This is one of the very strong correlations that we see with hip function and musculature and how much stress the feet are taking on. The thing that's interesting about the feet is that when there is limited function or when they are trying to compensate, right? Because our bodies are always trying to compensate if there's an issue. When they're trying to compensate, they can either take their stress and like kind of channel it down, which they hit the floor, which, you know, there's not much to do with the floor. But then they can also like travel up the chain and start modifying how things are going up the chain. And so what we find is that because your foot directly hits the floor, which the floor isn't really going to move under you, it kind of, a lot of times dysfunction can travel up the chain and start affecting the hip and vice versa. So we find a lot of times that when there's dysfunction in the hip, there's limited motion, there's tightness in the hips, which means there's weakness in the hips. That means that there's going to be compensation that is channeled down into the knee and into the ankle. And then a lot of times it just manifests there in the ankle, causing stress in the feet or specifically in the Achilles, because again, there's nowhere for the foot to pass off the stress except for into the floor. And the floor is not very squishy giving. There's nowhere for it to hand off. So definitely start thinking about function happening in the hips as well as the knees, because both have this high influence over how the feet and ankles are feeling and functioning.
Absolutely. So especially if you are doing more higher impact stuff, whether it's like box jumps or depth jumps where you're jumping down, landing for something where you are kind of rapidly bending at your hips really quickly. The hips can actually have a really big influence over what's happening at the ankle. If the hips don't flex as well, meaning like your thigh doesn't come towards your chest as well, then you may be required to start to pick up more motion at your ankle in order to compensate for that, which can stress out your Achilles given enough reps, and especially if you're doing it, repeatedly and rapidly, like you're jumping down from a box or something like that. Another thing is, the glutes. If the glutes aren't firing, the glutes are a hip muscle. If the glutes aren't aren't strong and firing correctly, that can cause, the calf muscles to try to compensate more for those, in order to, like, every time you propel yourself forward, there's something called triple extension: extension at the hip, extension at the knee, and extension or plantar flexion at the ankle. Okay, and so if the glutes aren't working well, it can cause muscles around the ankle to try to overwork in order to compensate for that, again, which can put more stress through the Achilles if those muscles are pulling on the Achilles more and more and more than they normally would. Hip rotation is another thing to consider with, Achilles issues, where if the hips aren't able to rotate well because the muscles that would be doing rotation aren't able to contract efficiently, it can cause the foot to have to rotate more, which every time, the foot supinates or pronates, it gets that heel to move, and the heel is one of the bones that the Achilles attaches onto, or I should say is the bone that the Achilles attaches onto. And so every time that area has to move, that can stress out the Achilles more. So just, there are other motions of the hip as well. But just thinking kind of along those lines of like, okay, yeah, like if this area of my body isn't moving well enough because the muscles aren't functioning well enough in order to move that area, other areas of my body are going to have to compensate. And so, with the hips, we see a very direct connection to what's happening at the foot and what's happening at the ankle, and in particular, what is happening, then the stress that the Achilles has to take on in response. The third area that we really want you to consider is what's going on with your trunk, your core muscles, your low back muscles, the muscles that control your spine. Because here's the thing, is even though like distance-wise, the area of the Achilles and the area of the core are pretty far from one another, similar to how the hip muscles have a direct impact or can have a direct impact over the Achilles, the core, low back, trunk, spinal muscles can have a similar impact over the Achilles as well, where if you are not able to rotate through your core well enough because those muscles are dysfunctional, again, you may be forced to pick up more motion through the foot, which can stress out the Achilles. If you are not able to flex or extend through your trunk as well, you may be forced to pick up more motion at the ankle, again, which can put stress through the Achilles. So just understanding that what you are feeling symptomatically from an Achilles perspective, while there likely is some kind of a local thing going on, it doesn't mean that there's always a local thing going on with the muscles that control the Achilles. And more times than not, there are issues going on with muscles around the knees, around the hips, and throughout the trunk as well.
Charlie, I love that you left it off on that note, because I was going to say just that, how it's so often that when people come to see us for MAT, they've already tried some stuff. And usually that means they've tried something local to where their pain is, right? Their back hurts, they've done something on their back. Their Achilles hurts, they've done something with their Achilles area or their ankle, right? And so often, probably most strongly with that number 3 spot, with the trunk and core, we see weakness in the trunk and core or limitations that are causing issues down in the feet. Because remember, our bodies are always trying to compensate. Our bodies are always going to try to cover up all of our weaknesses, even if it means that we have pain or symptoms somewhere, especially with something like the Achilles tendon. The Achilles tendon is not a muscle, right? So it's not like it can contract. It's just responding to its environment. If it changes its strength or whatever, that's going to take years and a lot of time, whereas muscles can change really quickly. Like within an hour session, they can change because they're very active changing tissues. And so whenever there's a responsive tissue or a passive tissue like a tendon, like the Achilles tendon, that's stressed out, we always need to be thinking, what is creating this environment that's causing it to be stressed out? Even if you got an acute injury where you landed funny from a jump or something, and now that acute, that instance, you feel like that is what caused my Achilles to get flared up, we still need to think almost environmental. Like, what kind of environment is this Achilles living in? Is it being stressed from the muscles of the core? Is it being stressed because it's trying to compensate for weak muscles in the hips? Is it being worked harder than it needs to be worked because of a weak knee or an inactive knee or something going on in the knee? So we really want to think in a bigger, broader scope. And when we work with our clients in that way, we find that people are healing so much quicker because we're taking stress from the muscle system, which is the thing that puts stress on the tendons.
All right, so how do you go about doing this? What things should you be considering with your own workouts and everything like that? Well, the first recommendation that we have is to definitely seek out a certified MAT practitioner because they are going to have the training and the knowledge to be able to assess the various areas of your body that may be influencing and contributing to what you are experiencing with the Achilles. Like we said at the beginning, kind of what the cornerstone principle of muscle activation techniques is the idea that tightness is secondary to weakness. And so if your Achilles is feeling particularly tight, that can often be a sign that there are muscles that are not working well, there are muscles that are weak, there are muscles that are dysfunctional, both at the ankle as well as through the foot, the toes, and then through, the rest of it going up the body as well, the knees, the hips, the trunk, just like we talked about today. But an MAT practitioner will have the ability to assess your body and figure out where the bigger areas of dysfunction are that again could be contributing to what you're experiencing with the Achilles, and then have the ability to address those areas and address those muscles directly.
The second thing you want to be thinking about doing is making sure you're doing full body strength training, especially the 3 areas that we talked about today. Well, and the 4th, which is the ankle joint and the feet. So the ankle, right? We talked about that. The knees, the hips, and the trunk and core, like your midsection area. You really want to make sure you're strength training in those areas using the 4 exercise for life principles, because oftentimes muscles start to lose their function for 2 reasons. Number 1, the muscles might not be able to receive appropriate signal from the nervous system, which is what MAT addresses. But number 2, you might just not be using them very much, and they might be deconditioned. And so we want to make sure that you are strength training regularly. If you are already strength training and you feel like you've checked this box, just double check and make sure you're using the exercise for life principles. Oftentimes we see that when people are not using the exercise for life principles, they're moving way too fast, they're using way too much range, they're not focused on the right things like the muscle contraction, and they're not focusing on their moving and non-moving parts. When those are all out of whack, oftentimes this can lead to muscle inhibition, which then takes you back to number 1, where you're losing neuromuscular connection, which then you need to go back to step 1, which is find that muscle activation techniques provider. So we want to be checking both boxes. Number 1, making sure all muscles are connected neuromuscularly. And number 2, making sure that we're keeping them in good functioning condition, meaning you are strengthening and challenging them appropriately and regularly.
Now, with the Achilles, even though these symptoms can be relatively similar from one person to the next, the areas of the body that need to be addressed, that need to be strengthened, that need to have their function improved can be very different from one person to the next. For some people, it's just going to be the ankle itself that needs to be, strengthened and that needs to have its function improved. Other people may need their feet and toes. Some may need their knees. Some may need their hips. Some may need their trunk and core muscles, okay? It is going to be different one person to the next. And so that is why these 2 recommendations of 1, getting your body assessed to figure out exactly where you need your strength and function improved, but then also making sure you are doing total body strength training, not neglecting any of the areas that we brought up, that we discussed, and making sure you're utilizing the 4 exercise for life principles while you're doing each of your exercises. That's why those recommendations are so important. So if you are in the Chicagoland area or are willing to travel to the Chicagoland area and would like to see us at Muscle Activation Schaumburg for muscle activation techniques, all you have to do to get scheduled up is go to www.matschaumburg.com. On our website, there's a big green button that says Get Started. You can click that and see our availability and get yourself scheduled for your initial consultation and assessment. And if you'd like to learn more about the 4 exercise for life principles and get our guidance implementing them into each of your workouts, you can get access to all of our workouts and programs for free for the next 30 days by going to www.exerciseforlifestudios.com. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that has been battling Achilles issues on and off, over the last 3, 5, 10 years, however long, and they are feeling like, well, every time I try to get my Achilles issues resolved, we are just focused on the Achilles itself. Share this episode with them so they can understand the role that other areas of their body may be playing in what they are experiencing with their Achilles, and how to go about getting those other areas assessed and any dysfunction strengthened up and addressed. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to us and leave us a rating and review. Helps other people who are looking for information on exercise and who are looking for information on health find our podcast as well. So if you enjoyed this conversation, let us know by leaving us that 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.